My mother refused to take my son to the hospital while I was away on a business trip because she had brunch plans with my golden child sister and told me to handle my burden on my own. So, I did exactly as she asked, and now she's sending $10,000 worth of gifts for my son, but this was the final straw for me. Someone so twisted, so utterly self-absorbed, that they would knowingly endanger your child's life, not once, but twice. And then, try to make you feel guilty for it. Because that's exactly what my own mother did, and it broke me, but it also woke me up. Look, my relationship with my mom, Sylvia, has been a roller coaster since I was a kid. But this crossed every line imaginable because it started affecting my son, Jaden. After my dad passed away unexpectedly, it was just Sylvia, my younger sister Jane, and me. Mom was bitter, always. People excused it, saying, "Oh, she lost her husband, raising 2 girls alone." But I was a spirited child, always smiling, full of life, and I never got that same kindness back. Jane was only 2 when Dad died, so I stepped up, trying to help Mom, taking care of Jane, keeping her entertained. Sometimes, I'd get a fleeting acknowledgement from Mom, but that was it. That was all the love I got. Eventually, I started lashing out. I became exactly the ungrateful child she expected. By 13, I was working part-time, doing chores, even babysitting Jane. Mom would come home from work, and no matter what, she'd find fault. Everything was wrong. Fights became our daily ritual. So, I built a wall. I just became aloof. Jane, she tried to get close after that, but I pushed her away. It became crystal clear that Jane was Mom's favorite. The favoritism was so blatant that Mom skipped my high school graduation because Jane had a sniffle. But that's a whole other story. The second I could, I was out of there. College in another city, and absolutely no contact with Mom. Neither of us bothered. Jane and I would still text casually, but that was it. A few years into college, I got married. And then, my son Jaden was born. Jaden, my sweet boy, is allergic to 10 different food items. Life-threatening allergies. The doctor recommended a vegan lifestyle for us, and we embraced it. Meanwhile, my marriage dissolved into something abusive, so I filed for divorce and moved back to my hometown. Jane heard I was back and wanted to see Jaden. So, I invited her over. But she showed up with Mom. Sylvia acted like nothing had ever been wrong between us, like years of silence and hurt just vanished. It felt so weird, but Jaden was so happy to have new company, so I let it go for the moment. Later, after Jaden was asleep, I confronted Mom about the no contact. Jane jumped in, apologizing for Mom, saying it was inappropriate but that this was Sylvia's olive branch. She reminded me that they were the only family I had left. I didn't agree, but the way Mom pleaded to be part of Jaden's life, and seeing how happy he was earlier, I decided to give it a shot. Things were okay for a few months. I got a hybrid marketing job, working from home for Jaden. Jane was at college an hour away, visiting sometimes. But Mom, she'd show up almost every weekend, supposedly to help, but she'd just take over my house, acting like I was still living under her roof. I let it slide at first, thinking, this is just Mom. But her controlling nature got out of hand. I knew if I confronted her, it would be a huge fight, and I didn't want Jaden to see that. So I asked Jane to talk to her. Jane agreed, and I felt a bit of relief. What happened next was hell. The very next day, Mom called, practically screaming about how I should have talked to her directly, like an adult, instead of complaining to my sister. I tried to tell her it wasn't a good time, but she just kept going. So, I put her on speaker and went back to work. She must have realized it because she hung up abruptly. Later that evening, Jane called, telling me Mom was disappointed and even cried about how I handled the call. I told Jane, very clearly, that I was done being pushed around like I was as a child. I wanted Mom to stay out of my and Jaden's life for a while. Jane tried to argue, but eventually she agreed. A text from Mom followed, a half-hearted apology, promising to keep her distance. A year passed. Jane graduated. Jaden turned 4. I still saw Mom occasionally at family events, and things were usually fine. Then one day, I had an urgent work situation. I asked Jane to babysit Jaden, but she had a job interview. She suggested Mom. I was beyond skeptical, but it was the only option. Mom was thrilled. I gave her a quick rundown of Jaden's allergies, what to do if something went wrong. But she cut me off, practically scoffing. "You can trust me with your child. I raised you, after all." I still handed her the cheat sheet, emphasized calling me immediately if anything happened. She nodded, and I left. My work usually took 2 to 3 hours. Easy, I thought, for someone who just bragged about her parenting skills. An hour and a half later, my phone rang. "Get to the hospital, ASAP." My heart stopped. I apologized to my bosses, rushed there. Jaden had had an allergic reaction. I was shaking with fury. I told Mom to wait outside while I was with Jaden and the doctors. They told me he'd eaten cookies with gluten, one of his 10 severe allergens. He was stable, but it could have gone very wrong. I promised the doctor it would never happen again. I took Jaden and Mom home. Jane was already there. I asked her to take Jaden to his room. Then, Mom and I had it out. A dramatic, ugly fight. Mom initially tried to blame Jaden, saying he ate the cookie when she wasn't looking. But she quickly crumbled, admitting it was her fault for not listening, for not checking the cheat sheet. I was done. "There is no way you can be around Jaden without my supervision anymore," I told her, my voice raw. She started crying, calling it a mistake, saying I was too harsh. But I stood my ground. This was about my child's life. She left. Jane followed her. Later, Jane texted, accusing me of being too harsh. I told her straight up that if she defended Mom, she'd face the same consequences. Jane backed down. I hired a professional babysitter, Nancy, fully vetted. And honestly, I didn't need Jane for Jaden anymore. Our relationship drifted. We went back to rare texts, no personal life discussions. And I was okay with it. A few months later, I had another work emergency. It was the day of Jaden's monthly doctor's appointment. Nancy was at the hospital with her own child. I called Jane. She answered, claiming she had a work commitment, then suggested Mom babysit. I was about to remind her what happened last time, but before I could, Mom's voice boomed from the background. She hadn't realized I was on the line. She was ranting, saying she wouldn't babysit Jaden, even for money, because dealing with his condition was a burden. She went on, blaming me for not being a good mother, for keeping the burden of dealing with Jaden all to myself. My blood ran cold. I hung up on Jane and immediately called Mom. She picked up, started apologizing, saying she was supposed to have brunch with Jane, and she was just frustrated. I told her I wished her to stay away from me and this burden forever. She tried to patch things up, but her apology wasn't sincere. It was out of fear. I hung up. Jane didn't defend her this time. She apologized in texts, but I ignored them. She had lied about working. I took a rain check at work, took Jaden to his appointment myself. From that day on, I decided I wouldn't initiate contact with my family. A year passed. Jaden constantly asked about Grandma. It tore me apart, but I diverted him. His 5th birthday was approaching, and we'd chosen a school for kindergarten. I sent out a few invites, including Jane, but not Mom. Jane came, carrying a huge bag of gifts, looking expensive. I told her not to spend so much, especially on a child who would probably lose interest quickly. She said one gift was from her, the rest were from Mom. I didn't know what to say. I asked her to take them back. She refused, saying she didn't want to get between Mom and me, and suggested I at least consider Mom's gesture for her grandson. Jane's words made me feel a pang of guilt. Maybe I was being too harsh, keeping Jaden from his grandma, especially since they enjoyed each other so much. After the party, I decided I'd call Mom to talk things out. Once everyone left, Jaden and I started opening presents. Of course, he went for the big bag from his grandma. I pulled out a plushie for his school bag. Reaching in for more, I found multiple boxes of cookies from an expensive bakery. Cookies made with ingredients Jaden was severely allergic to. My stomach dropped. How could she be so thoughtless? So focused on a grand gesture that she didn't even check. I tried to hide them, telling Jaden the plushie was all that was in the bag, but he threw a tantrum and found them. He started begging me to open a box. I called Mom. I told her the gift was dangerous and asked her to convince Jaden it wasn't for him, since it was her gift. She was ready for a fight, expecting me to apologize and thank her for her excellent gift. When I explained the danger, she flipped. She started screaming, giving me examples of how she raised me and Jane, saying if I weren't such a weird hippie with my vegan lifestyle, Jaden wouldn't have these issues. I was stunned. But I didn't have time to argue. I just needed her to talk to Jaden. After more complaining, she finally did, telling Jaden the cookies weren't for him, and she'd bring his real gift tomorrow. Jaden, surprisingly, listened. I thanked her for calming the situation and hung up before she could say another word. I fell into a rut. Overthinking. Her words, blaming me for Jaden's health when she was clearly in the wrong, triggered so much childhood trauma. I called Jane, hoping she'd understand, help me sort things out. But she just told me to let it go because that's just how Mom is. That was it. I decided right then I wouldn't discuss my problems with Jane again. And I wanted to teach Mom a lesson. The next day, she showed up at my door with another gift. I looked her dead in the eye and told her to leave. Since you're so unhappy with me and my lifestyle, so much so that you're willing to put your grandson's life in danger, I said, my voice steady, you don't deserve to be in our lives. She started in with her usual guilt trip. I raised you through hardships and you just steal my grandson from me. I don't want you around anymore. I cut her off. Then she tried a new tactic, asking about the expensive gift she sent. I went inside, grabbed the entire bag of presents and a checkbook. I handed her the bag and wrote a check for the one gift Jaden had opened. There's no need to be petty, she snapped. But I was determined. No strings attached. She left, disappointed. Breaking the news to Jaden was hard. I told him Grandma would be gone for a while because of personal plans. He accepted it, thankfully. Jane called later, hysterical. Mom was throwing a tantrum, apparently sick from it. Jane wanted me to apologize, fix things. I just said, that's how Mom is. She'll be fine. Jane called me unempathetic and hung up. I was fine with that too. My relationship with Jane was clearly affected, and Jaden might never see his grandma again. Could I be the bad guy for this? Update 1. Honestly, thank you to everyone in the comments. I truly wasn't in the wrong, and it helped to hear that. My relationship with Jane. Yeah, it's strained. But she's partially to blame for constantly justifying Mom's actions. I always understood Jane was the golden child, but I knew it wasn't her fault, but Mom's. Jane has always been easygoing, trying to balance us both, never problematic, just non-confrontational. That's why she always said, just let it go. But she needs to learn that relationships can't be maintained by being a doormat, especially when Mom throws tantrums. Update 2. About a week after the last incident, I hadn't heard from Jane about Mom. But knowing Mom, I suspected something. I decided to take Jaden on a short vacation before school started, just to escape. Before we could leave, my paternal aunt called. I haven't mentioned my relatives much because most of them either enabled Mom's behavior or turned a blind eye. This call was unexpected. My aunt immediately launched into a tirade about Mom being hospitalized and how I couldn't even visit her. Mom had apparently called her and a few siblings, bad-mouthing me for abandoning her. I just told my aunt it was complicated and to stay out of it. She started calling me names, and I hung up. I expected more calls, but blocking my aunt sent a clear message. Jaden and I left the next day. Our vacation was amazing. I stayed off tech, which was so needed. When we got back, my phone was full of missed calls and mails accusing me of being an inconsiderate daughter and a terrible mother. Mom was still playing the victim, spreading her false narrative. It hit me. The only way to get through to her was through Jane. I had missed calls from Jane too, so I called her back. She didn't answer, so I left a voicemail, telling her to keep Mom from spreading rumors and that this was a warning about the consequences if the harassment continued. She called me back that night, acting like nothing had happened between us. I wasn't having it. I told her to get to the point. She said Mom was practically begging to talk to me. I initially refused, but Jane kept persuading me, so I agreed. Mom was overjoyed on the phone, talking as if everything was normal. I cut her off. Why do you want to speak with me? I asked. She said that ever since I told her to stay away from Jaden, she'd been suffering in silence. Funny, considering she was bad-mouthing me to anyone who'd listen. She claimed she'd accept any conditions if it meant being a part of Jaden's life. I hadn't realized how attached she'd become to him. She even vaguely mentioned it as a way to reconnect with me too. As much as I wanted to sympathize, I couldn't forget how she'd endangered my son's life twice, then tried to blame me. I said no. There wasn't much more to say. I ended the call and went back to my life. Things quieted down after that. Jane hadn't reached out. Everything seemed to be going my way. Then, last weekend, I got an invite to a childhood friend's wedding. I usually skip these, but my friend insisted. I hadn't even considered Jane would be there, so seeing her with Mom as her plus one was a shock. Jaden was thrilled to see Grandma. Mom controlled her excitement in my presence, but my mommy radar was on high alert. I kept Jaden close. I greeted them normally. As I headed to my table, Mom asked if we could talk. I didn't want to cause a scene and thought it best not to engage, but then Jaden started having a meltdown, desperate to be with Grandma. He even suggested we all sit together so Mom could spend time with him and I could ensure his safety. To avoid escalating his tantrum, I agreed. The night went well. Mom was civil, Jaden had a blast, and Jane and I actually caught up. She apologized for blaming everything on me, and we cleared the air. I didn't talk much with Mom, but that was fine. As the night ended and we headed to the parking lot, Mom stopped me. "Did tonight go poorly?" she asked. I told her it was fine. Then she asked if, based on these few hours, she could be part of our lives again. "Mom," I said, "I only allowed you to be around Jaden tonight because it was the only practical option. You endangered his life, twice, and you've never taken responsibility for it. There is no way I'm letting you near him again, even if it makes me the villain in my son's eyes." She started crying right there. Jane tried to calm her, guide her to the car. I knew I needed to leave. I rushed to my car with Jaden, who was upset seeing his grandma like that. Mom tried to coax him into going with her, but he was scared, clinging to me. Her crying turned into wailing as people started to gather. I drove away. After putting Jaden to bed, I called Jane. She spoke in hushed tones, asking me to call back later. I did. The next day, Sunday, after Jaden was fed and chores were done, I sat him down. I explained that he wouldn't see his grandma anymore and that he needed to avoid interacting with anyone outside of school without my permission, especially Jane or Grandma. I think the previous night's incident helped him understand. Soon after, Jane called. She said she couldn't talk last night because Mom became hysterical at the mention of my name. I told her it was fine and asked if everything was okay. She said things were fine for now, but she feared Mom's behavior indicated a bigger issue. I agreed, sharing my concerns about Mom potentially bothering us again. Jane understood and even suggested a restraining order if Mom didn't improve. I've even considered moving. Update 3. I'm writing this final update a month later, and thankfully, this issue is now resolved. After Jane voiced her concern about Mom's behavior, she wisely got Mom checked out. Mom was diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder. A psychiatrist recommended admitting her to a private mental health institution for a while, given her age, for better care. Jane discussed it with Mom, and surprisingly, Mom understood and accepted the doctor's advice. The institution is in another state, so Mom and Jane will be leaving next week. I knew Jane didn't have the money for this, so I offered to help financially, but she said Mom was covering the cost. I backed off. Jane also passed on a message from Mom to Jaden, saying she would get well soon and see him when his mother allowed it. This whole journey, it's been intense. I never wanted things to get this dramatic, but sometimes, protecting your child means making impossible choices. What about you? Have you ever had to draw such a hard line with a family member for the sake of your kids? I really want to hear your thoughts on this.